regulation. My name is David Quiros, and I'm the manager of the Freight Technology section here at CARB. We are the ones that are overseeing the amendments to the Hovercraft regulation. We have a lot to cover today, and we'll start shortly, but before we do, I have a quick request of all of you. If you could rename your Zoom name, if you're using the Zoom platform, to include your organization name or acronym, dash, and then your name to follow. That would really help us keep track of all of the attendees. And you can do that by right-clicking on your icon in the Zoom interface. You can do it a number of ways, but if you right-click on your icon and then go to rename, you should be able to rename yourself. We'll also be advancing the slides through the Zoom platform, but the slides were also posted yesterday to the URL at the screen, at the bottom of the screen. If you're on the phone, you'll need to follow along, and we'll do our best to announce the slides so that you can see where we're at. We'll advance the slides on our end. In the workshop today, we're going to provide an update on the draft proposed concepts, building on what we released last March. I and my team are really appreciative of your written comments that we've received and all the time that you spent to meet with us over the last few months to better understand your operations. A lot of the team is on the line today, and some of us are going to be presenting, and we'll introduce ourselves in sequence as we move about the presentation. Before I introduce our first speaker, I'm pleased to introduce that our branch chief, Bonnie Soriano, and division chief, Heather Arias, are on the line with us today. And we're also joined by Alex Wong, who's our attorney from the legal office. We have a lot to cover today, so at this point, as more attendees join us, I'm going to turn the presentation to Marissa Williams, who's our lead staff on the regulatory amendments, and she's going to talk more about the agenda and how we're going to go about the presentation today. Thank you all.
Next slide, please. Thank you, David, and good morning, everyone. Today's workshop on the proposed amendments to the Commercial Hovercraft Regulation, or as we'll sometimes refer to as CHC, is intended to provide information on CARB's CHC rulemaking effort, updates to proposed regulation concepts, and updates to our cost analysis. First, we will briefly review the regulatory history, and then we will provide updates on our draft proposed regulation amendments. We will then take a break for questions. Following the first Q&A break, we will then provide an update on the emissions inventory and vessel categories, and we will present updates to our cost analysis, followed by a final break for questions. You may submit questions through the chat box at any time during the presentation. Staff will read and answer questions at the end of the first section break or at the end of the workshop presentation. Please note that this workshop is being recorded and will be posted on the Commercial Hovercraft webpage for future reference. Next slide, please. First, we'll briefly provide some background on the Hovercraft rulemaking. Next slide, please. We want to recognize the efforts that vessel owners and operators have undertaken already to reduce emissions from hovercraft. Since 2009, commercial hovercraft owners have replaced older engines with newer, cleaner engines to comply with the existing regulation. Specifically, the existing CARB regulation has required turnover to Tier 2 or 3 marine or off-road engines that will be fully implemented by 2022. And some hovercraft owners not subject to end-use requirements have voluntarily replaced engines. Many of these engine replacements have been funded by CARB's Carl Moyer program, administered through local air districts. Next slide, please. Despite the progress made, there is a need to further reduce emissions from hovercraft. Staff proposed in the 2018 board hearing to reduce emissions from hovercraft as one of several actions additional to state implementation plan actions. The need to include hovercraft in these actions was determined by staff's scoping evaluation of port emission sources, which showed that hovercraft is still the third highest contributor to near source cancer risk near the ports of LA and Long Beach. Reducing emissions from hovercraft will help achieve reduction in community health risk, attain regional air quality standards, and mitigate climate change. The commercial hovercraft regulation is also included in CARB's blueprint strategies for the AB 617 Community Air Protection Program. Because of this identified need, CARB staff began the informal rulemaking process for hovercraft. Next slide, please. Rulemakings at CARB are an iterative process with many opportunities for public engagement. Our first public meetings on the new commercial hovercraft rulemaking were in December in Sacramento and Long Beach. Our first public meetings on the new, around that time, Cal Maritime began work on their feasibility study, and we distributed owner-operator surveys to collect information on vessel engine costs and activity. The Cal Maritime Academy prepared a feasibility study for CARB, which was released in October 2019 and is posted to CARB's website. The study evaluated 13 hovercraft vessel categories, including feasibility of retrofit diesel particulate filters, or DPFs, retrofit DPFs with selective catalytic reduction systems, or SCRs, and Tier 4 engine repowers on in-use vessels. The results showed that retrofits and repowers are more feasible for some vessels than others, and illustrated what types of vessel modifications may be needed. The study also served as a starting point for evaluating costs, which we will discuss later in the presentation. In March 2020, we presented our refined proposed concepts and preliminary emission inventory methodology at a public webinar. Based on feedback we have received from stakeholders and from further analyses completed by CARB staff, today we are presenting updates to some of our proposed concepts and a preliminary cost analysis. We have also posted numerous draft documents to the CHC webpage on our regulation language: cost analysis workbook, cost analysis supplement, cost metrics, and funding programs. We encourage stakeholders to review the draft language, cost assumptions, and other documents and provide feedback. Next, we anticipate taking our proposal to the board in mid-2021. We will continue to incorporate feedback from stakeholders and will post key rulemaking documents: our standardized regulatory impact assessment, or SRIA, detailing our economic analysis, and our initial statement of reasons, or ISOR, staff report prior to the board meeting. Next slide, please. Throughout our rulemaking process, we have received over 50 comment letters or other written correspondence, with some including multiple attachments with technical analysis. And we have met individually with many of your companies and trade organizations to better understand your operations. Non-confidential letters have been posted to CARB's CHC website, and all information was considered in revising draft proposed amendments. Next slide, please. These are the general types of comments we received since the last webinar, and we will respond to them more specifically as we discuss the changes we have made in response throughout the presentation. In summary, we received comments regarding feasibility of meeting Tier 4 plus DPF on in-use vessels and cost of compliance, suggestions for updating the population of commercial hovercraft operating in California for our emission inventory and cost analysis, discussion of fleet operational and technology availability impacts to meeting proposed compliance schedules, questions regarding specifics on our compliance fees and opacity testing concepts, feedback on the value of incentive funding to achieve emission reduction goals for hovercraft, and requests to accelerate the deployment of zero-emission technologies where feasible, while considering infrastructure needs and deployment timelines. Next slide, please. Now that we have recapped where we are in the rulemaking process, we'll go over some updates to our draft proposed regulation amendments. Next slide, please. While the performance standard concept we shared in March has remained relatively unchanged, there are a number of updates to our proposed regulation concepts that we will discuss today. These include updates to low-use exemptions, compliance extensions, zero-emission and advanced technology requirements, opacity testing, facility reporting and infrastructure requirements, and our compliance fee schedule. We will discuss each of these updates in more detail, but first I will turn the presentation over to my colleague Andrew to discuss performance standards, Tier 4 engines, and diesel particulate filters.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Andrew Damiano. I'm an engineer in the Freight Technology section. First, to review the proposed regulatory concept from our March webinar, we are proposing more stringent requirements for in-use and new vessels and an expansion of the regulatory requirements to vessel categories that were previously exempt. Our proposed concept is a performance standard equivalent to Tier 3 engines plus a DPF for engines below 600 kilowatts, or Tier 4 plus a DPF if there is an available engine model that is certified to Tier 4, and Tier 4 engines plus a DPF for engines 600 kilowatts and above. Our proposed concept includes engines less than 50 horsepower. In addition, the low use exemption would remain with some modifications that we will discuss later in this presentation. We are proposing multiple pathways for meeting the performance standard. These include repowering or rebuilding engines to Tier 3 or 4, plus installing a CARB verified level 3 DPF. Installing a Tier 3 or Tier 4 engine certified by US EPA and equipped with a DPF from the original equipment manufacturer, or demonstrating that vessels meet the performance standard during normal operation another way. Finally, we are not setting Tier 3 plus DPF performance standards to require NOx reductions due to some retrofit SCR challenges, but our compliance pathways allow for retrofit and/or OEM SCR strategies to be used to meet performance standards if they are CARB verified. Next slide, please. CARB staff has developed performance standards based on existing Tier 3 and Tier 4 standards as shown in tables 7 through 9 on pages 57 through 59 of the draft proposed regulatory language. NOx standards are equivalent to existing Tier 3 or Tier 4 standards, while PM standards are approximately equivalent to 85% lower than Tier 4 PM standards. Proposed Tier 4 plus DPF performance standards for propulsion and auxiliary marine engines over 600 kilowatts are either 0.005 or 0.010 grams per brake horsepower hour for Category 1 engines, depending on the power subcategory. Next slide, please. As of today, US EPA has certified 40 unique Tier 4 engine families ranging from 600 to 7,458 horsepower. In August of 2020, US EPA amended 40 CFR Part 1042 to delay Tier 4 engine certification requirements for high power density engines until 2022 or 2024. Delays provide more time for engine manufacturers to develop and certify high power density Tier 4 engines used in some high-speed vessels that are not commonly used in California. CARB staff do not expect these amendments to impact meeting Tier 4 plus DPF compliance schedules. Next slide, please. The US EPA certifies new marine engines operating in the United States, including California. The marine engine PM standard of 0.04 grams per kilowatt hour can be met without using DPF technology. Some marine engine manufacturers have already certified with DPFs even when not required to meet PM standards. CARB staff established a new method C1 referenced in our draft regulatory language section to allow for US EPA certified engines to meet the performance standard. Please see page 63 of the draft proposed amendments. Next slide, please. US EPA new engine certification requires a deterioration factor demonstration with thousands of durability hours required in the lab. However, some marine engine manufacturers have accrued durability hours after engines are installed in the vessels under test engine exemptions. CARB has had discussions with EPA regarding development of in-use certifications utilizing test engine exemptions. European Stage 5 marine requirements took effect in 2019 through 2020, depending on the engine power subcategories. Engines over 300 kilowatts were subject to EU Stage 5, January 1st, 2020, and include a solid particle number standard of 1 times 10 to the 12 particles per kilowatt hour, effectively forcing the use of a DPF. In-use certification via test engine exemptions may provide a streamlined approach for marine engine certifications in the US that would meet CARB draft proposed standards for Tier 4 plus DPF. Next slide, please. CARB's existing verification regulation, 13 CCR, parts 2700 through 2711, specifies requirements for aftermarket DPF approval. CARB staff established new method C2 in draft regulatory language to allow retrofit with a DPF installation to meet performance standards. Compliance method C2 requires one to replace the in-use engine with a US EPA certified marine Tier 3 or Tier 4 engine, or with an off-road Tier 4 final engine that does not meet CARB performance standards, and retrofit with a CARB Level 3 verified diesel emission control strategy, or a DPF. A diesel particulate filter, DPF, in the draft proposed amendments regulatory language document is a Level 3 verified diesel emission control strategy, or VDEX, capable of reducing diesel PM by 85% or more. Next slide, please. Over the past 2 decades, tens of thousands of retrofits have been installed on-road, off-road, marine, stationary, and freight equipment. There is one CARB verified marine device, currently a Level 2 VDEX, which is capable of a 50% reduction in diesel PM emissions. CARB staff has met with multiple DPF manufacturers regarding potential future marine markets for commercial hovercraft. To address stakeholder safety concerns, CARB has directed prospective applicants to work with the U.S. Coast Guard Marine Safety Center on design and approval specific to marine vessels. There are 2 different potential pathways to compliance: through 1, EPA certified OEM equipped with a DPF, and 2, EPA certified Tier 4 engines plus a CARB verified DPF. CARB is looking for and encouraging any regulated stakeholders willing to work with EPA and EU Stage 5 engine OEMs to further develop additional pathways to compliance. Okay, so now that I have covered in-use performance and compliance, I will turn the presentation over to my teammate, Nick, to discuss exemptions and extensions.
Great, thanks, Andrew. Good morning, my name is Nick Taylor, and I'm an air technician in CARB's Freight Technology section. We're on slide 18 for folks following on the phone. So now that we've reviewed the in-use performance standard proposal, let's go over updates to the compliance pathways and new options for vessel operators to comply. Staff have been working on a number of ways to provide additional flexibility, and this includes updates to the low-use exemption thresholds. The current low-use compliance pathway exempts engines from the in-use requirements as long as the engine's hours do not exceed an annual threshold. This annual threshold is currently 80 hours for dredges and barges and 300 hours for all other vessels. These thresholds will remain in effect until January 1st, 2023, when these amendments that we're discussing would come into effect if adopted. Staff proposed to change this pathway to instead reflect the distinctions between engine tiers rather than vessel type in order to minimize regulatory costs while maximizing reductions, as well as to provide flexibility to stakeholders who have upgraded to cleaner engines. These new thresholds would apply equally to all vessel categories and by the engine tiers indicated in the table shown here. For Tier 0 engines or engines without an emission tier, one must demonstrate that annual engine hours have not and will not exceed 80 hours per year as part of their operation. For Tier 1, annual hours cannot exceed 300 hours. For Tier 2, annual hours cannot exceed 400 hours. And for Tier 3 or Tier 4, annual hours cannot exceed 700 hours. Next slide, please. So slide 19, staff also proposed to allow the acquisition of new engines which do not meet the in-use requirements if the new engine is replacing an engine which is certified to a less stringent standard and the new engine will be operated as low use. The intention here is to provide additional flexibility at minimal loss to emission reductions while continuing to remove engines with the lowest standards. In other words, if an engine will be low use in any case, we want to allow for the engine to be replaced to higher emission tiers. If an engine was replaced under this provision, the applicable annual hour threshold moving forward would be the new higher tier. And for one final note on low use, our March 2020 concepts proposed a cap of 5 vessels per fleet to be eligible for low use. We now propose to not count any California home-ported vessels to this cap. So this cap will only apply to vessels home-ported outside of the state. Next slide, please. So slide 20. New low-use thresholds are one change to the compliance pathways, but CARB staff also propose a number of modifications or additions to the available compliance extensions. The table here summarizes both the existing and proposed compliance extensions with their applicable regulations section as posted in the draft regulation language. The existing regulation allows for compliance extensions under certain circumstances, including a change in annual hours of operation, if there is no suitable replacement available, if there are delays with the equipment manufacturer or installation, and when there are multiple engines on multiple vessels within the same fleet that have the same compliance dates. These extensions may be referred to by the last 2 values of their subsection, E1, E5, etc. So if someone says E6, for example, this is what's being referenced. The first 2 rows in this table will sunset on December 31st, 2022, as opposed to the other existing extensions that will be carried forward. Our proposed concept effectively replaces the no suitable replacement provision and will add compliance extensions for several scenarios. We will now cover all of the new or modified extensions, and I'll also circle back around to put them together again as a whole once we've gone through them individually. Next slide, please. So slide 21. For facility infrastructure delays, CARB staff is proposing a 1-year compliance extension, which is renewable once for a total of 2 years. This is applicable for any vessel or engine technology that requires infrastructure, where due to unforeseen, temporary, or extenuating circumstances, which are outside of the facility or vessel owner or operator's control, the installation or use of dock power or zero-emission fueling infrastructure is prevented. Now, this E1 extension will be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. There is already an existing provision for unexpected delays in equipment manufacture or delivery with respect to hovercraft engines. This provision simply provides a similar extension for facility infrastructure delays. We would appreciate feedback on specific obstacles here, as we have not had any facility requirements in the CHC regulation until now. Next slide, please. So slide 22. Our proposed concept modifies the existing E2 extension for no suitable replacements to allow up to 2 extensions of 3 years each beyond the initial compliance date for most vessel types subject to the in-use requirements. Now, this extension is for entities who demonstrate a lack of technical feasibility on an existing vessel and the inability to pay for a replacement vessel to meet performance standards. To get an extension under E2, the vessel owner would need to submit a technical analysis to CARB showing a lack of feasibility and submit a financial analysis to CARB showing a lack of ability to pay for a replacement vessel. After 3 to 6 years, the vessel would need to be replaced or retired if there is still no feasible pathway to achieve the performance standard on the existing vessel. Now, staff are still exploring this concept of evaluating an ability to pay, or ATP for short, but examples of potential methodologies for evaluating this include using the US EPA's publicly accessible ATP models, such as ABLE, IndyPay, and MuniPay. This is an area in which we would particularly appreciate public input, including what thresholds and assumptions do stakeholders feel should be set in order to provide ATP extensions. Another aspect for this that we would particularly appreciate feedback on is whether an additional 3-year extension for a maximum extension period of 9 years would make a significant difference. And just to reiterate this before moving on, this ability to pay extension is only applicable if it is demonstrated that the vessel in question would need to be replaced in order to comply with the emission standards. Next slide, please. We're on slide 23. Because feasibility and vessel replacement is taking on a new significance, staff propose a new compliance extension, E5, which is 1 year for one engine on a vessel that has multiple engines with different compliance dates. So for example, if a vessel has a model year 2009 port engine and a model year 2010 starboard engine, since the vessel will need to be laid up for a new engine, it makes sense to replace both engines at the same time. Since vessel replacement will be necessary in some scenarios under these proposed amendments, this extension helps consider engines as a group. This is intended to provide additional flexibility for operators wishing to replace multiple engines at the same time, rather than piecemeal. Next slide, please. We're on slide 24. Since our last workshop on these amendments, we received many comments from stakeholders about a potential lack of Tier 4 engines and/or DPF availability in the marine sector. Staff have taken this into consideration and propose a compliance extension, E6, for situations where no certified engines or CARB-verified DPFs are available to meet the applicable compliance deadlines. This extension would be for 2 years and has no cap on the number of renewals. This extension requires a technical evaluation of all US EPA certified engines and all CARB verified DPFs that meet applicable performance standards by the applicable compliance deadline. This review would have to result in finding no combination of existing engines or DPFs are available. The evaluation must be submitted 6 months in advance of the applicable compliance deadline or 6 months before the previous extension expires for the renewal. In situations where engines certified to current emission standards are available, but CARB verified level 3 DPFs are not, these engines must repower with the current emission standards, and an engineering analysis must be submitted to evaluate the availability of verified DPFs. In short, this E6 extension can be applied on the basis of either a lack of engine availability or VDEX availability. Once options are demonstrated to be feasible, staff propose to count extensions granted under this E6 extension towards the total time allowed under potential subsequent E2 extensions. So for example, if a vessel has received 4 years of this E6 extension because a system is not available and a system becomes available, but an operator requests an E2 extension for concerns around feasibility and ability to pay, this extension would only be available for 2 years in that case. Next slide, please. All right, slide 25. Another issue that was raised has been how to handle an engine that is already Tier 4, but for which it is not technically feasible to add the DPF without replacing the vessel. We propose that if Tier 4 engines are operated above certain annual thresholds, we would still require Tier 4 plus DPF, even if this means vessel replacement. However, we also propose that vessel replacement is not required if operating below these thresholds, at which we calculate emission reductions would cost more than $100,000 per weighted ton. In other words, while we are pursuing the Tier 4 plus DPF standard, staff recognize that in cases where a vessel with Tier 4 engines must be replaced just to add the DPF, the incremental benefits combined with the high cost of replacing the vessel does not add enough value to be warranted. Now, this extension requires a technical feasibility analysis, which demonstrates that the DPF is not feasible. This analysis is to be performed by a third-party naval architect 6 months in advance of the applicable compliance date. Engines receiving this extension will need to be reevaluated every 2 years. This provision provides more time for vessels in which Tier 4 plus DPF is not feasible and reassesses feasibility should new technology become available. Next slide, please. We are on slide 26. So we've gone over a lot of individual compliance pathways, so let's take a moment to review what this looks like when they all come together. This may be a slide that folks want to review again even after we have moved on. So first, low use. We are changing this to reflect engine tier rather than vessel category. If an engine is low use, then it is not subject to our emission requirements. Next, availability. If, after a review, no systems are found to be available, then a renewable 2-year extension would be made available. However, if systems are available and they are feasible to install, then Tier 4 plus DPF is simply the standard that must be met for those cases. But if it is demonstrated through a third-party review that these systems are not feasible, then we have to ask more questions. Is the engine already Tier 4? In other words, is it only the DPF that is the problem? If so, then as long as the engine restricts its hours below the thresholds described of between 2,000 to 3,500 hours, depending on the vessel category, it will be considered compliant. But if the engine is not already Tier 4, then we ask if Tier 4 is feasible. If it is, a Tier 4 replacement would be permitted instead of a Tier 4 plus DPF. However, please note that adding a Tier 4 engine resets the compliance date to that of the new engine. So this option is less of a compliance conclusion and more of a provision for some additional flexibility. Now, at the bottom, if things get to this point, either Tier 4 is not feasible or the engine's annual hours exceeds the thresholds for Tier 4, then this is where the ATP evaluation would come in. At this point, this tree of pathways has pruned away enough scenarios that if vessels are getting to this stage, then in the aggregate, replacing them is cost-effective for emission reductions. However, replacing a vessel is never cheap, and so the proposed ATP evaluation, if the ATP evaluation finds the owner or operator entity to be unable to pay for a replacement, then an extension could be provided for 3 years and renewed for another 3 years if this evaluation holds. This gives vessel operators additional time to prepare and plan for replacements, as well as for more systems to become available that meet the Tier 4 plus DPF performance standards. Generally, Tier 4 engines have the latest compliance dates in 2028 to 2031 to meet Tier 4 plus DPF. This means that except for perpetually renewable extensions, the latest possible compliance dates would be in 2034 and 2037. So I will now turn the presentation over to Jen Lee, one of our engineers, who will discuss other proposed regulation updates.
Thank you, Nick, and good morning, everyone. My name is Jen Lee Wang. We will now turn our attention to proposed additional requirements for new tugs, new excursion vessels, and short-run ferries, also known as the requirements for zero emission and advanced technologies, or ZET. For new tugs, we initially proposed requiring enhanced efficiency diesel-electric technology starting in 2025, for which we expected some emission reductions beyond conventional technology. But after further analysis, CARB staff have removed the proposal for new tug enhanced efficiency requirements as existing vessels are not demonstrating a fuel benefit with a potentially compromised reliability and increased cost. For new excursion vessels, we are proposing the zero-emission capable hybrid requirement be accelerated a year earlier by January 1st, 2025. And for new and in-use short-run ferries to be zero-emission, we are proposing to accelerate the phase-in date to January 1st, 2026, with an up to 2-year extension for infrastructure delays, as noted by Nick, under extension E1. We also want to note that if zero-emission or advanced technology is adopted early or when not required, additional compliance time may be granted to another vessel in the same fleet. We will discuss this concept more shortly. Next slide, please. We have also clarified the short-run ferry definition for ferries that work on multiple routes. A short-run ferry is a vessel dedicated to provide regularly scheduled round-trip ferry service between 2 points that are less than 3 nautical miles apart for more than 20% of service trips. In other words, vessels providing less than 20% of the service trips during a given calendar year are not considered short-run ferries. The new definition intends to exclude short hub or interlining vessels, but include circular routes that may include one-way trips slightly longer than 3 nautical miles. Vessels that make multiple stops in a single round trip, where more than half of the single trip lengths are less than 3 nautical miles, and the longest single trip length is less than 6 nautical miles, are considered short-run ferries. Next slide, please. We are also proposing alternative compliance pathways, or ACP. The existing regulation contains a pathway called Alternative Control of Emissions. We are proposing replacing this with ACP. 2 options would be available to vessel owners. One would be to use alternate technology or combination of technologies to achieve greater or equal emission reductions as the Tier 4+ DPF equivalent standard. And the other one would be to adopt zero-emission or advanced technology where not required, and then be eligible to receive additional compliance time for another vessel in the fleet, as long as it operates in the same air basin as a new advanced technology vessel, because we would need to ensure that clean vessel projects do not increase emissions elsewhere. We also want to point out for this second option that the emission reductions achieved by the advanced technology vessel would not necessarily have to be equivalent to the emissions that would result from delaying compliance of another vessel. But the goal of this option would be to incentivize the adoption of advanced technologies. Additional compliance time will be provided regardless of how early relative to the compliance deadline the technology is adopted. In implementing option 2, zero-emission capable hybrid technology would grant the fleet 3 extra years of compliance time for another vessel. And the zero-emission technology would grant the fleet 7 extra compliance years for another vessel. Next slide, please. To elaborate on alternative compliance pathway option 1, this compliance option would require applicants to demonstrate to the EO that the alternative reduces the same or more emissions than achieved by the CARB performance standards. For alternative control of emissions, CARB staff has maintained a list of alternative complying technologies on the Hovercraft website, which has to date included Tier 2 rebuild kits. We are also aware that some manufacturers may be developing Tier 3 rebuild kits that we intend on posting on our website after US EPA approval. However, moving forward, medium engine tier standard alone is not sufficient to meet the more stringent CARB performance standard. Therefore, we will consider ACTs such as rebuild kits along with other strategies such as cleaner fuels or hybrid systems as part of ACPs under option 1. We are making use of duct power a requirement. Therefore, this will not be eligible under ACP as it is currently. Similarly, we worked with the excursion vessel operator to perform PAPS testing to evaluate the emission benefits of using 100% renewable diesel R100 in an in-use marine application. The report will be posted when it is ready, but preliminary results confirm laboratory testing data from on-road trucks. Emission benefits are on the order of 10% for NOx and 30% for PM, which is not sufficient to meet the expected reductions from upgrading engines alone. Even if combined with the fuel-saving enhanced efficiency diesel-electric system, CARB staff are not aware of approaches to achieve the level reduction achieved by using DPF. Therefore, although it is not included in the draft amendments text, CARB is considering requiring use of R100 for all hovercraft. And we're seeking your input on this measure, especially if you have experience sourcing and using this fuel in your fleet. If you're not familiar with R100, it fully conforms to ASTM D975 and is a drop-in substitute for fossil carb diesel. Next slide, please. We will now switch gears to discuss other draft regulatory requirements, the first of which is on opacity testing. As noted in our March 2020 webinar, CARB has received complaints about smoking in hovercraft in several areas of the state, and there is no mechanism in the existing regulation that requires vessel owners to identify the cause of excess emissions and to take corrective action. CARB staff have also conducted opacity measurements on hovercraft under a wide range of steady state and transit conditions to inform appropriate opacity limits. Thank you to all of the vessel operators who participated in this testing. Based on this testing and feedback from stakeholders, we have revised the opacity testing frequency to test every other year rather than annually, while retaining CARB's ability to audit records at any time. This will help minimize downtime costs and concerns with frequent testing for operators. We have also added a proposed language specifying that engines equipped with DPFs shall not exceed 5% smoke opacity while adapting SAE J1667 procedures. CARB staff is still evaluating field data to propose opacity limits and procedures for engines not equipped with DPFs, and vessels with wet exhaust systems will still be subject to testing. Staff is seeking feedback on methods to test wet exhaust systems and opacity limits. Next slide, please. Another draft regulatory requirement is on facility infrastructure. Zero emission and advanced technologies need infrastructure to support their use. And these proposed requirements are intended to accelerate the adoption of zero emission and advanced technologies. Proposed responsibilities for zero emission infrastructure include for facilities to install and maintain dark power infrastructure, for vessel owners to install and maintain infrastructure to support zero-emission vessels, and for facilities to allow vessel owners to install infrastructure for their operations. We have clarified the definition of a facility to be someone who has direct control over the daily operations and is responsible for collection of revenue from vessel owners who dock or moor. Staff is also recommending a dock power infrastructure threshold based on 50 vessel visits per year at a particular facility. For the purpose of this subsection, a vessel visit is a period of time lasting between 1 and 24 hours with the main engine idling or auxiliary engines operating at a facility. For example, 50 different vessels operating 2 hours each, or one single vessel operating consecutively for 50 days would each equal 50 visits for a given facility. Next slide, please. Analysis of vessels reported and California DMV and US Coast Guard data indicate that more than 1/3 of vessels are not reported. Operators state that competitors are operating out of compliance, and such operation undercuts companies that are operating legally. Compliance rate of inspected vessels, mostly reported vessels, is approximately 92%. To increase compliance, CARB has proposed facility reporting and vessel labeling requirements. However, this requires time and resources. CARB staff is seeking your feedback on what new approaches or requirements could help improve compliance. Next slide, please. Facilities are currently not required to report under the existing regulation. However, under the new proposed requirements, facilities would be required to report vessels renting, leasing, or contracting sleep for 13 or more days. The purpose of this requirement is to increase compliance with the vessel reporting requirements. But we are not expecting facilities to become involved with the CARB enforcement activities. For specific facility reporting requirements, CARB staff has revised the reporting frequency to quarterly instead of monthly, where reporting would be done through an online reporting system. Starting January 1st, 2023, facilities will be required to maintain daily records of date, local time, position for each facility tenant. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Since March 2020, CARB staff has also clarified the draft compliance fee structure. CARB is authorized under Health and Safety Code section to develop a fee schedule to recover costs associated with the compliance of off-road or non-vehicular engines and equipment. Staff developed a draft schedule based on costs of personnel, equipment, and operational costs for implementation and enforcement, resulting in a need of $1.9 million per year. Stakeholder comments received also indicated some auxiliary engines are already subject to local air district permits. CARB staff therefore proposes a fee structure to recover costs through each vessel and the main engine aboard each vessel, which includes a 25% lower fee for fleets operating a single vessel only, and assesses a higher fee for the low-use compliance pathway due to additional staff time to review demonstration. Next slide, please. This slide shows the annual fee amount per vessel, per main engine and per low-use engine. Note that this would be annual fees. Staff is seeking input on draft regulatory language. This slide provides a list of questions to get feedback. We want to repeat that the draft language we have presented today are still under development. We need information to further refine the draft language to ensure the hovercraft regulation is aggressive yet feasible to implement. We are also open to feedback and information that is not included on the list. If there are concerns regarding confidential information, please discuss those with us. At this point, we will take a break for questions, and I will turn it over to David to help facilitate this portion of the workshop.
Thank you, Jinlei. We've provided a lot of content, so are going to take a moment to answer questions. In terms of timing, let's go perhaps 20 minutes on these questions, and then we're going to resume the next part of the presentation to make sure we get through all the content. If you haven't already, you probably noticed that some questions are coming in the chat feature. What we're asking you to do is type your questions there. We'll respond to them in the order that they were received. And then I know those of you that are on the phone can't type your questions, so what we'll do is we'll save a few minutes and allow phone-in attendees to unmute themselves, perhaps starting with first number of the area code or something like that. So the first question that we wanted to respond to is from TJ Tarabulski. What % of vessels subject to the existing Harborcraft rule are in compliance? And I think that was answered on slide 33, where we quoted a 92% compliance rate based on enforcement inspections so far. But I will say that in our discussions with many of the vessel operators, we've heard anecdotally that there are competitors that are not compliant and undercutting those that have complied. So to maintain a level playing field, that's one of the reasons why we are proposing the facility reporting concept. And we're also exploring other opportunities to get EIS data summarized and sent to us through some of the marine exchanges. So if anybody has other ideas on how to improve the compliance rate or knows of non-compliant operations, our enforcement division enforces this rule actively, intends to increase compliance, and will take your complaints seriously if you have them. The next question we got was from Christy at Souse Brothers. And she says, when you're talking about the number of hours of main engine operation, are you counting operation while operating in California or total operating hours? And the short answer is hours in California, the regulated California waters only. That's currently a record keeping requirement, and it'll continue to be a record keeping and reporting requirement. The next question is from Timothy French. Does CARB acknowledge that a preemption waiver will need to be obtained from EPA for all of the proposed engine standards applicable to new and in-use vessels? So I'll start by saying that to the extent that this rulemaking does require an authorization, we will request one from US EPA. Alex Wong is our program attorney. I don't know if you wanted to add anything more specific about any of the particular elements of this rule, or if that's enough for now. Okay.
Yeah, hold on. I'm still, this is Alex Hong, staff attorney. So, so Tim, I mean, this is a workshop, the rule has not yet been promulgated, so we're not able to give a definitive response. But of course, as a regulation gets further and further developed and have a better indication of what elements will or will not require an authorization, then, of course, CARB will request an authorization for elements that do trigger the authorization criteria.
Okay, thank you, Alex.
Sure.
So our next question was just to me, and it was from Alberto Alcala at Scania. It was a rather long question. So Alberto, if you're on the line, would you unmute yourself and verbally ask your question just to make sure I convey it properly?
Yes, good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to contact y'all. Can you hear me? Yes, thank you for the opportunity to contact, to make a comment and participate. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Excellent. The basis of the question is simply understanding that there are Tier 4 engines below 800 horsepower advertised in the marketplace, and also understanding that not all engines at the same horsepower are equal. Some engines may have an unlimited hour a year, continuous 100% load factor capability, while another engine at the same horsepower is not capable of unlimited hours nor continuous operation. In that case, where the horsepower is identical, yet duty cycles very different, would CARB consider an engine not capable of the operating profile that a customer requires or an operator requires as not being a viable Tier 4 engine instead of a capable Tier 3 engine? Hope that made sense.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Andrew Damiano, would you like to respond to that question?
Sure, David. Thank you, Alberto. That's a good question. So, yeah, in short, I guess the quick answer would be yes. CARB would have to acknowledge that the different duty cycle capabilities of different engine series would have to be taken into consideration depending on the requirements of the vessel location.
Thank you.
Sure.
So our next question is from Marty Robbins at WETA, and this was just sent to us directly. So he asked, how were the hour thresholds determined for the E7 compliance extension for the different vessel categories listed? And just to reiterate, that was the hours that would allow a Tier 4 engine without a DPF to continue operating as long as you're below that threshold. Can you provide some transparency for those determinations? Why would a crew boat operating by or for a private for-profit oil company be allowed to operate at higher hours than a public transit ferry? So I'll start this and then let Bonnie Soriano respond to the rest of it. The cost per emissions reductions was calculated based on a replacement vessel cost. So the numbers or the difference between those categories that you see there has to do with a few inputs, with the primary one being the replacement cost for a vessel if it would need to be replaced. So a petrochemical tank barge that's 500 feet long would cost a lot to replace if replacement was needed to achieve Tier 4 plus DPF. Other factors that were considered were the load factor of engines for that category, as well as the emission factor of engines. So Bonnie, I don't know if you wanted to add to that in regard to how we used cost per ton calculations as a guideline.
Sure, thanks, David. I think you gave a pretty good technical background. I mean, and of course, if you have more questions for transparency, we'd be happy, to meet with you directly, because those were calculations that staff did. I mean, basically it was, as David mentioned, it was a balance between the cost of replacing a vessel and the emissions reductions gained from that cost replacement. And they used a guideline of $100,000 per weighted ton to find those points where it became, cost effective to set a limit versus requiring a replacement of the vessel. And so we'd be happy to have further discussions on exactly how those calculations were done. But basically it was a cost and emissions benefit balanced by using that cost effectiveness number.
So moving on to the next question, we received one from Ron Wiley. How will the visualized compliance pathway be applied to engines less than 600 kilowatts where EPA Tier 4 engines are not available due to the 600 kilowatt EPA regulatory power limit? Our approach and our thinking so far, and I think this is clarified in the reg language, but if it's not, let us know, is that by a compliance state, if you have an engine that's below 600 kilowatts and a Tier 4 engine is not certified, and at this time there are not a lot of engines that are, then Tier 3 would be the standard. Tier 3 plus DPF would need to be the performance standard that's met. So it would be what's available on your compliance date. Let us know if that doesn't answer your question. So I want to move on to the next two questions that are similar. One was from Angel Island Ferry, and another one was from Stacy Callis, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. And I'll just read them both and then we'll respond to them together as they're related. One is, how does CARB plan to fund the large landside infrastructure upgrades needed for a zero emission vessel, particularly for privately owned companies? Stacy asked, will infrastructure be in place to accommodate the zero emission initiative? California's electrical capacity is already challenged. Will microgrid planning and backup sources of power be funded by the state? Those are good questions, and we recognize that zero emission technology has both an equipment side as well as an infrastructure side, and that the permitting on the infrastructure side can be complex and the cost can also be significant. So from a regulatory standpoint, we're still evaluating the cost of these per emissions reduced. And we recognize that there are going to be infrastructure costs that are likely going to need to be borne by the regulated entities, public or private. That said, we recognize the role of incentive funding, and one of the materials that we released last week on our website in preparation for this workshop is a list of all the available incentive funding opportunities that we know of that apply to Harborcraft at this time. So Ashley Eriks, if you're on the line, I don't know if you wanted to speak anything more specifically to the incentive programs that are on that handout that we released.
No, David, I think you captured it well. I think to the extent that some of the incentive programs, cover infrastructure versus just sort of the vessel, I think that's, something we're happy to provide more additional detail on, but would recommend starting with the initial list that we put together. And of course, let us know if there are other sources that we haven't included, or any comments or concerns you have about the list that we put together. We'd be happy to take a look at that. Thank you.
And before we go on, I'll just add that coming up in the next slides, we have a question for you all, and that's whether convening a type of CARB, other agency, stakeholder working group to help talk through and identify some of the hurdles that are being experienced on the infrastructure side would be helpful. So if you think that would be helpful, and it would be helpful if CARB, our group, gets involved to start some of those discussions, perhaps on a every other month basis, let us know, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. We received another question from Angel Island Ferry. How will CARB guarantee power with the rolling blackouts, fires, and PG&E power shutoffs now common in California, especially for vessels required for emergency services, such as vessels who participate in SFVMAP? And we appreciate the conversation we've had with Angel Island Ferry, I believe last week or 2 weeks ago, about this issue. Andrew Damiano, would you like to respond to that, about what our thinking is and the provisions we put into the requirement for a zero emission short run ferry?
Sure, David. So the quick answer on that would be CARB cannot guarantee that power is going to be available 100% of the time, given unforeseen circumstances or natural disasters. I don't think anyone could. So understanding that some of the subchapter K vessels that operate throughout the state are part of that VMAP, that's the Vessel Mutual Assistance, I believe it's program or plan. CARB is not opposed to allowing these vessels that are part of that program that may need to respond in an emergency to have emergency backup generators, or be retrofit or designed to be a hybrid vessel with two different power sources with a diesel backup, with the cleanest available diesel engines, of course. So that's kind of the quick answer on that. We're still looking into it and trying to contact some of the VMAP folks and figure out exactly what's going on with that program and with the Coast Guard, and how we're going to have to accommodate those requirements as well. So still developing that. All right.
Thank you, Andrew.
Sure.
Yeah, so we're thinking that zero emission vessel could have a diesel generator on it for backup purposes only, and it would be limited to the proposed low use thresholds. If you have feedback on that, let us know. So I'll take a couple more questions from the chat, and then I'm going to move on to those that are on the phone in case you have them. This one is from Tyler Harris, saying, have you considered that the requirements to upgrade to new diesel engines in the next decade will cement diesel use in for the next 10 plus years, when we need to move to zero emissions before the end of the useful life of some of the engines? I'll say yes. Marissa Williams, do you want to respond to this question about how we're balancing cleaner combustion through Tier 4 plus DPF with zero emission requirements for a subset of the vessels?
Yeah, I'll start and allow others to chime in here. We have been looking at feasibility of zero emission for specific vessel types. And so we're balancing that with feasibility on other vessel types that we're thinking that zero emission might not be feasible in the short run. And also considering for those vessel types that we are suggesting zero emissions for, evaluating the current fleets to look at if they are at the end of their useful life and primed for a transition, so that we're not I guess, forcing turnover where the resources aren't necessarily available or feasible.
Thank you, Marissa. And if our proposal is not requiring zero emission technology where it is feasible, we'd like to hear about it so that we can reconsider cementing in combustion technologies for another useful life of that equipment. So thank you for that question.
Hey, David, it's Bonnie. I also wanted to talk about you want to talk about slide 29 a little bit, where it talks about the alternative compliance plan to really, you know, push zero technology and hybrid technology, push the development, and that can be used as part of complying with the regulation.
Yes, absolutely. So slide 29 is on the screen. If zero emission technology is available and you want to deploy it, it would certainly meet the Tier 4 plus DPF performance standard. And then in addition to that, if it's on a vessel category, we're not required, for example, ship assist or harbor assist escort tugboat, then under ACP option 2, we're going to allow for extra compliance time to be available for another vessel in the fleet. So that would provide an extra incentive to try to push zero emission technology, even if the mathematics doesn't quite work out where as a fleet the emissions are lower. It would still be trying to do something we can from a regulatory incentive perspective to incentivize the use of zero emission technology. So there's a couple other questions in the queue, and we will get to them. If we don't get to them by the end of the meeting, we'll respond to you in writing, but I did want to make sure we had time to go over any questions from those on the phone. So I see there's at least 10, maybe 15 dial-in attendees. If your area code starts with 1, 2, 3, or 4, and you have a question, go ahead and unmute yourselves and ask the question.
Hi, David, this is Marissa. I wanted to provide some additional context for those on the phone. To unmute yourself, push *6, and that should allow you to speak. When you begin, please introduce yourself, as David said, name and affiliation, please, for our records.
Good morning, David.
Hey, good morning.
Yeah, this is Javier with Floss Maritime, Long Beach, California.
Hi, Javier.
My question is regarding opacity testing. It says here then proposing that as of January 1st, 2023, vessel owner operators must perform opacity testing. Can you get a few more details on that as to who can do, anyone in my company can do that, or would we have to hire a third-party vendor, CARB authorized, to send those performance opacity tests to you every other year? How would that work?
That's a fair question. The opacity concept is one that has had the least development since March, and we appreciate the work that you and FOSS have done to help us develop these concepts. Andrew, do you want to respond to what our current thinking is about opacity testing?
Sure, David. Good morning, Javier. So our current thinking on that would be the companies would be able to do the opacity testing themselves if they were to have their in-house technicians certified in an appropriate testing program, or they could hire a third-party testing company that is certified. So there's a couple different options there.
Okay, roger that. I'll follow up with you to see what it would take for an in-house technician to be certified in that. Obviously, we wouldn't want to incur yet another cost.
Yeah, I believe there's some CDET training programs available at some of the technical colleges throughout the state.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks for the question, Javier. I'd like to open it up for anyone with an area code 5, 6, or 7 as well. anyone on the phone have questions? Okay, hearing none, we're going to resume the presentation, and then at the end we'll come back to any unanswered questions so far. We will get back to you even if it's not before the end of 11 o'clock. At this point, I'm going to turn control of the meeting to Wei Lu, who will go over the emission inventory and vessel category updates.
Hi everyone, my name is Wei Liu. We presented our preliminary emission methodology and the results for the CHG emission inventory in March workshop. And we got some feedback from stakeholders about the method and result. We thank you for that. And today we'll present the updates we made to the inventory based on these feedbacks. And we will present the preliminary emission result and its implication to our proposed amendments. Next slide, please. First, let us review the emission calculation methodology. CHG emission will calculate it using this equation here. And the emission equals to engine population times engine horsepower times engine activities times engine load factors times emission factor and times fuel correction factors. We have presented each parameter in detail in the March workshop. Based on the comments from stakeholders, we made some updates to these parameters. Next slide, please. First, we made some update on the vessel categories. We have a different regulatory requirements in our proposal and the cost inputs for different ferries. So to consider these differences, we subdivided ferries to catamaran, monohull, and short-run ferry to match with the regulatory requirements and cost inputs. And then we recategorize the barges category to better character different barge activities and emissions. We basically added a towed chemical barge category to the barge category to have a total 4 barge vessel categories in our emission. And then we renamed the charter fishing to commercial passenger fishing vessel to align with the industry standard to prevent confusions. Next slide, please. And we also made some update on the vessel populations. We had about 1,900 vessel population in the CARB reporting database. We scaled up the vessel population based on the Coast Guard data. In the previous methodology, we used all the Coast Guard data, which is about 3,700 vessels. And based on the stakeholder information, that vessel without a valid certificate documentation or COD are not in operation. So we adjust the vessel population downward about 10% from the baseline, previous baseline population by removing those unvalidated COD vessels. And we use a slightly different scaling methodology we presented in the March workshop. We held the CARB reporting vessel population from Port LA and Long Beach, Oakland, Richmond are constant because their reporting vessel population is much more comprehensive. Then we scale the remaining reporting vessel population by vessel type based on the population identified by CARB staff and the Coast Guard data. Next slide, please. So this table compares the previous baseline population and the updated baseline vessel population. For the total vessel population, because we're only including the active US Coast Guard COD status vessel, the total vessel population changed from 3,700 to about 3,300. And as discussed before, we broke out the ferry category and recategorized the barge category. And for the commercial passenger fishing vessel, we got the numbers of inspected vessels from stakeholders. We thank you for that. And we also contact the Department of Fish and Wildlife for the number of permits they issued. So based on the number of permits they issued, we added 330 vessels that's carrying 6 passengers or less, resulting in a total population of commercial passenger fishing of 508 vessels. And there are some other changes population for other vessel categories, which are shown in this table. And next slide, please. This slide shows a 2023 statewide preliminary CHC NOx emission and the DPM emission by vessel types. And the solid blue bar shows the NOx emission in tons per day, and the red bar shows the DPM emission tons per day. And the commercial fishing vessel were modeled to remain among top emitters for NOx and DPM, accounting for about 21% of statewide DPM emissions and 17% statewide NOx emissions. And we're thinking the ATP tug emissions are overestimated. We are requesting additional ATP tug operation information from tug operators so we can update the ATP tug emissions. And the next slide, please. So next, we look at the location of commercial fishing activities because it's a higher, have highest emission for both DPM and NOx emissions. So this slide shows the statewide CHG commercial fishing transit heat map. This map was created based on 2017 AIS data that we downloaded from Marine Cadastre website. It shows the vessel transit count within the state. And the green line here shows where the vessel went during the whole year. There are some yellow and orange lines that has a higher transit count, not shown in the big map, but they exist in some of the closing to shore area. The heat map basically shows where the vessel activities occurs during the year. The purple line here is 24 nautical mile regulated California water boundary. About 92% of commercial fishing vessel activity occurs within the 24 nautical mile regulated California water, with most activity happen close to the California shoreline, and they're close to the nearby shoreline communities. And next slide, please. And this slide shows a closing in view of CHC commercial fishing transit heat map at both the South Coast and the Bay Area. Basically, this two map shows that there are more vessel activity near the port, like in the Fisherman Wharf at San Francisco, Port of LA and Long Beach in South Coast, and the near Port of San Diego. So the location of this vessel activities suggests the commercial fishing will have a significant impact to the nearshore communities. So reducing the commercial fishing emissions will lower the health risk for the nearby shoreline communities. Next slide, please. So based on the emission inventory result and source locations, commercial fishing is a significant harbor craft DPM emission sources. And commercial fishing vessels make up about 37% of CHG population in California. And the commercial fishing was not included in our proposed concept in our March workshop proposal. And we recognize the unique economy consideration for commercial fishing vessels, and the vessel replacement will be common to meet Tier 4 plus DPF standards. So we propose the following requirement for commercial fishing. And we suggest they're requiring only for pre-tier 1 and tier 1 engine to tier 2 engine minimum for commercial fishing vessel. And we're also suggesting a later implementation date, which fits in 2030 through 2032 to allow for the owner or operators to apply for carbon border fundings for commercial fishing vessel. And we expect the vessel owners will comply with the regulation by retrofit the engines to tier 3 engines during the proposed compliance date, because the engine availability during that time, and the existing tier 2 engine would remain compliant with no further actions. So by doing this, we expected by including commercial fishing in the regulation would reduce an estimated of additional 7% NOx and 17% BPM relative to total emissions when the regulation is fully implemented. Next slide, please. So this slide summarizes our proposal requirements, which we already covered in the previous slide. Our proposal regulation will expand this vessel category subject to in-use requirement. Currently, the vessel category subject to the in-use engine requirement, including ferries, excursion vessels, crew and supply vessels, barges that do not meet the definition of ocean-going vessels, dredges, and tugs and towboats. Our proposal regulation was still including these vessel categories, but would add new vessel categories as were presented in our original proposed concept. This vessel including commercial passenger fishing, all barges, pilot vessels, research vessels, workboats, and the temporary replacement vessels. We're also proposing as an update provided today to including commercial fishing vessels. Vessel categories that would not subject to the in-use requirement, including historic, military, Coast Guard, emergency vessels, and recreational vessels, and ocean-going vessels, which are regulated, the ocean-going vessels are regulated on the separated control measures. One thing to point out here is that we are currently proposing that workboats not be limited in their compliance extension, because we're seeing that the potential cost of replacing special purpose built vessels will be very high relative to the potential emission benefits. Also, commercial fishing vessels are not eligible for extension E3, or the equipment manufacturer delays or installation difficulties for extensions, which is for 6 months. So that concludes my part of the presentation. Now I'll hand over to Ashley to talk about the cost analysis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wayne. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ashley RX, and I'll be presenting preliminary cost data for the proposed amendments. Based on the proposed regulatory concepts that were presented during our March 2020 webinar, and on updates to the proposal that have been presented today, we've put together a preliminary cost analysis that we'll review during this part of the presentation. We'll provide an overview of the inputs that staff use in the cost analysis, review preliminary cost estimates and key cost metrics, and identify areas where we are still seeking further input from stakeholders. Next slide, please. We'll start with some high-level cost estimates based on the cost analysis. This first table shows preliminary cost estimates broken down by cost input category. The values represent the sum of the costs that occurred during the regulation implementation period of 2023 to 2037. We've rounded the values for simplicity. Next slide, please. This next table shows a breakdown of the preliminary annualized cost estimates by year for the regulation implementation period of 2023 to 2037. You'll see that the rate of cost increase is higher earlier in the implementation timeframe, which can be mainly attributed to the fact that an increasing number of vessel categories are reaching their initial compliance deadline within this timeframe. Next slide, please. The preliminary cost estimates we just reviewed were derived based on dollar per horsepower values for the following cost inputs: capital, labor, and installation costs, operational costs, which for engine repower include SCR maintenance, diesel exhaust fluid, and main engine fuel savings, and for DPF retrofits include regen fuel and cleaning. Loss of use costs, vessel residual/resale value, administrative costs, which includes things like record keeping and reporting, vessel labeling, opacity testing, implementation and enforcement, financial feasibility reports, and naval architect reports, and infrastructure costs, which include shoreside dock power and charging infrastructure for short-run ferries and excursion vessels. Wherever possible, we drive values specific to each vessel category to use in the cost analysis. In order to do this, we relied on data provided by industry stakeholders and the Cal Maritime Study. We encourage you to reference the cost analysis and cost analysis inputs and assumptions document for more information. Next slide, please. We believe that we've been able to build a robust cost model based on data received to date from industry stakeholders and in the Cal Maritime Study. However, in order to ensure that we've adequately accounted for costs, we are seeking input on certain cost metrics, and those include dry dock fee for when the vessel is hauled out of the water in order to do the repower and retrofit, labor and installation costs for the Tier 4 repower and DPF retrofit scenario, loss of revenue for time out of service during the repower and retrofit process. For naval architect report, both the upfront feasibility cost and the cost of blueprints to perform modifications, engine or vessel scrap or disposal values, costs of on-vessel or landside infrastructure for using dock power, profits from retiring/selling a used vessel, and for ferry operators, in order to calculate possible revenue losses due to passenger count reductions, we are seeking information about trip level passenger counts rather than average trip counts. Next slide, please. We are also evaluating potential updates to the cost analysis. Many of these potential updates are reflective of recent changes made to the proposed amendments and from input received from stakeholders. They include extending the analysis timeframe past 2037, updating the low use percentages for each vessel category based on the proposal for the new low use thresholds that were presented earlier, updating the engine and vessel inventory to reflect the updates that were presented earlier as well, updating the compliance scenarios to reflect the 3-year extension to postpone DPF if it is not feasible and the vessel is below a certain operating threshold, and updating the ferry retrofit plus DPF costs to include revenue loss due to passenger count reductions. Next slide, please. Based on the information in the cost analysis, we have developed industry-specific cost metrics and cost impacts to individuals that would result from the proposed amendments. These cost metrics and impacts are based on the projected annualized costs in 2031, and they are cost per passenger per one-way ferry trip for ferry vessels, cost per passenger per trip for excursion vessels, cost increase per harbor tug ship assist, cost increase per harbor tug ship escort, cost increase per 20-foot equivalent, and cost increase per gallon of refinery product. Next slide, please. Now we want to turn to the requirements that are part of the Standardized Regulatory Impact Assessment, or SRIA process, which is required for major regulations. The SRIA is a point-in-time estimate of the cost and benefits that would result from the proposed amendments. One of the requirements for the SRIA is to evaluate the costs and benefits of at least 2 regulatory alternatives in addition to the proposed regulation. These alternatives would be either more stringent than the proposal but potentially at a greater cost, or less stringent than the proposal, but with potentially fewer benefits than the proposal. We've asked for feedback during a December 2018 webinar and during a March 2020 webinar, and we are still seeking feedback on alternatives to the proposed concepts presented today. Additionally, we'd like to request input on any competitive advantages or disadvantages resulting from the proposed concepts. Next slide, please. We've also put together a list of potential funding programs for commercial hovercraft. The programs listed have different requirements and timelines, and more details can be found on the handout that is included as part of the workshop materials. We'd like your feedback about these funding programs, specifically if there are any barriers to taking advantage of the funding, such as the amount of funding available, funding caps, solicitation timing, lack of available technology or suppliers, etc. Thank you very much, and I'll now transition to Marissa to discuss CEQA and next steps before we break for Q&A.
Thank you, Ashley. CARB is preparing a programmatic level environmental analysis assessing the potential for adverse and beneficial environmental impacts associated with the proposed amendments to the Commercial Harborcraft Regulation. The EA is prepared according to the requirements of our Certified Regulatory Program under the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA. The EA will be based on the anticipated reasonably foreseeable actions undertaken by entities in response to the proposed amendments, which could have the potential to cause indirect physical changes to the environment. CARB is using the CEQA Environmental Checklist, Appendix G from the CEQA Guidelines, as a framework for assessing the potential for significant impacts resulting from reasonably foreseeable actions. The checklist includes criteria related to resource areas such as aesthetics, agricultural and forest resources, biological resources, cultural resources, geologic and soil resources, hazards and hazardous materials, among others. The EA will be included as an appendix to the staff report. The EA will include a description of the reasonably foreseeable actions that appear most likely to occur as a result of implementing the proposed amendments. It will also include the potential adverse impacts and feasible mitigation measures and an alternative analysis. Staff welcomes public input on the appropriate scope and content of the EA as it's being developed, including the reasonably foreseeable actions that may occur in response to our proposal, the potential significant adverse impacts, potential feasible mitigation measures, and feasible alternatives to the proposal that could reduce or eliminate any significant adverse impacts. The draft environmental analysis will be released for a 45-day public comment period with the staff report in 2021. We are requesting feedback on the cost information, updated regulatory proposal, and our regulation language by October 30th. We are also asking for your feedback, as mentioned previously, on the scope and content of the environmental analysis. CARB staff expect to take the amended Commercial Harborcraft Regulation to our board in mid-2021. Our initial statement of reasons staff report will be posted for a 45-day public comment period prior to the board meeting. As a reminder, the following draft documents have been posted to CARB's Commercial Harborcraft webpage, and we would greatly appreciate your feedback on these documents and on materials presented today. At this point, we will take our last break for Q&A, and I'll turn it over to David to help facilitate this portion of the workshop.
Thanks, Marissa. And for those of you that have submitted questions, thank you. We'll just continue going down the list. And those of you that have not, feel free to type them in to everyone or to one of us directly, and we'll answer questions until 11 o'clock and then assess where we're at that point. So I'm going to go back up to a question from Jacqueline Moore at the Port of Long Beach, asking to clarify what is being proposed as part of reporting by facilities. Reads as you are asking for tenant slip locations every day, not number and types of vessels, etc. And I will acknowledge first that we have changed a little bit on this, but I will explain a little bit more in a second. So if Leila Gonzalez or Jonathan Foster are on the line, would you like to take this question? I don't know if they're on the line. So I'll just say that our intent is not to require reporting on daily operations of facilities. However, from an enforcement standpoint, if an audit's done for a facility, our thinking was that if there weren't any records to audit, that some type of tracking was going on, it might be difficult for us to figure out whether reporting was done accurately. So our intent was to have a record keeping requirement, but reporting be a little less granular. So I hope that answers your question, Jacqueline. If you want to go off mute and let us know, that would be fine too.
Hi, David. This is Jacqueline. Thank you for answering my question. I think a bit more clarification, maybe at a later time, maybe perhaps a phone call with us, that would be helpful. Just trying to understand exactly what you're looking for and if we have pathways already available to us to provide and even collect these sorts of data. I think some discussions would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. And we're happy to do that and speak with any of the other ports or facility owner and operators as well. There's a question from Caltrans from Francisco Gutierrez saying, will the backup generator for the electric ferry need to meet the same requirements? Andrew Damiano, would you like to answer this one?
Sure, David. So like I mentioned earlier, the backup generator would have to be certified to the cleanest available standards available in that power subcategory. And potentially may require after treatment retrofits on it too, depending on the power subcategory.
Thank you, Andrew. And I'll just reiterate that all of these responses are draft. It's our current thinking. We're intending to go to the board in 2021, mid 2021 at the earliest. So we're looking for your feedback on this, if we should be less stringent, if we should be more stringent, and how we should reframe the requirements before we make our formal proposal. So I'm going to move on to a question from Michael Epstein saying, you acknowledge that the SFVMAP is a type of emergency response. Can you elaborate on other emergency response vessels, specifically low use? So you're right, there is a low use provision that would apply to any vessel, regardless as to how it's used. It would just depend on the tier level of the engine, pre-tier 1 to tier 4, having different hours per year in regulated California waters. Our regulation also has two definitions for an emergency vessel. One is a designated emergency use vessel, and that's a new definition in these amendments. And the other one's a temporary emergency vessel. The temporary vessel has been in the regulation already, which includes vessels that are brought into the state for disaster relief, and then they'll leave at the end of the response effort. We're not talking about changing that, and that's a really uncommon situation. Our group couldn't really think of when that's happened, but maybe it has happened without our knowledge over the last 10 years. The new provision is for designated emergency use vessels, and those are not going to be subject to the performance standards simply because that they are going to be low use and they are going to be primarily working for an emergency capacity, perhaps law enforcement in some specific types of law enforcement and fire suppression and things like that. The San Francisco, or the SFVMAP, I'm not sure exactly what that stands for at the moment. If that's an emergency response plan where vessels will change and be available to help in an emergency, our thought is that that is not going to change how that vessel operates. So for example, if a ferry is operating 4,000 hours a year, but it's on call to help with an emergency in a region, the vessel would still have to comply with the requirements for a ferry. The reason we put in the diesel backup generator being allowed on a zero emission vessel would be so that if there is a emergency, the vessel could change its operation, respond to the emergency, or still operate for critical needs if there's a power outage. So that's our thinking on that. We're looking for feedback if you think that's something that would operationally be a reasonable path forward. There were some more questions, Michael, you had on opacity testing. I'll just say at this point, we're continuing to work on those concepts, define what certification means and which companies could help out with the testing. So more information on that to come. I'm going to move down to a question on the emission inventory from Lou Browning. And I'm going to come back to the questions in a moment from Stardust Sport Fishing. So this question is best addressed from our inventory group. And I see that Corey Palmer and the lead staff, Liang Liu, are on the line. So I'm hoping you can take this. And Lou asked, is it possible to see the model year, engine count, and engine horsepower assumptions you used in developing the inventory? Corey or Liang, do you want to answer that question about your intended process for releasing information?
Hi, thanks for the question. This is Liang Liu here. David, do you mind repeating the question again?
Yeah, sure. And Lou, if you want to repeat this as well, you're welcome to. He says, is it possible to see the model year, engine count, and engine horsepower assumptions you used in developing the inventory?
So I think the engine count and engine model year data is all from our reporting, from CARB's reporting data, and we have the scaling method summarized too. But I think the final, we're still like working on finishing the methodology report, and we will publish it. I think before the board date, that like 45 days before the board date when that's required. But we can work with you if you want more of those input data. And we need to talk about the confidentiality issues, then maybe we can figure something out. So I do have all those data available, and we can talk about sharing how to best share the data, and if you want to contact me later. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Leon.
All right.
So I'm going to circle back to the question from Jaime or Jamie at Stardust Sport Fishing. His first comment is that there are only 175 commercial passenger fishing vessels in operation. Using licensed data is highly inaccurate. The majority of those 508 licenses are 6-pack boats using gas engines. So I just want to first thank you for the comment and say thank you to Ken Frank at the Sport Fishing Association of California and for all the other vessel operators throughout the state who worked with them to get us all of the information on the fleet that you did provide. The cost workbook that we posted has a lot of the cost information that you provided on what it would cost to replace your vessel. And we've considered that data to the extent that we think we can. And you may notice on the inventory slide, I'll just verbally go over it, is that we didn't make a big change to the population of commercial passenger fishing vessels. We do know that commercial passenger fishing vessels, 7 passengers or more, are in the 170, 180 range, and the remaining are those 6-pack vessels, or the vessels that can carry 6 passengers or less. It's our understanding that the remaining 300, 400 vessels are diesel powered after our discussions with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. If they are gas powered, there would be no compliance obligations for vessels that are 6 passengers or less and gasoline powered. So it's only the diesel powered vessels that are 6 passengers or less. And we've amended the regulation draft language to include those vessels because after looking at the engine sizes and some of the emission inventory information we have, it seems like they are significantly contributing to the emissions from that category of vessels. I'm going to ask Marissa or whoever's controlling the presentation to go to slide 54 for a second. a second question was raised about the burden of this regulation on small businesses or larger businesses because of the cost of compliance. We do acknowledge that the charter fishing, as we were calling it before, or now the commercial passenger fishing vessel category, is expected to be a category with more vessel replacements to comply. And that's based on discussions we've had with the Sport Fishing Association, as well as our feasibility report from the Maritime Academy. So in our cost analysis, we made an assumption of a larger number of those vessels needing to be replaced to meet the performance standards, and we've built in those compliance extensions. So if you look on slide 54, we calculated some metrics for what the regulation might cost a few industries. We didn't include the commercial passenger fishing vessels at this time, but we can to understand what the per ticket price increase would be to meet the tier 4 plus DPF or tier 3 plus DPF performance standard. So my colleagues can chime in if they want to say anything more, but I will just say we can work with you on creating a similar analysis of this cost to individuals, like what would a passenger pay extra as a result of this regulation. And then what would be really helpful for us is to understand whether or not, or how that cost may or may not be feasible if it's an incremental cost to comply. The charter fishing or commercial passenger fishing vessel category now does represent a significant portion of emissions. So from a public health protective standpoint, it's something we just cannot continue to exclude from the regulated in-use requirements. But Jamie, I don't know if you want to respond to that or unmute yourself and clarify.
Yeah, it just seems like you're unwilling to fully be open about the costs associated to our industry. Last I checked, California waters, international starts at 12 miles, but you're saying the range of 24 nautical miles. And for all other purposes, it's 12 miles. So I'm not sure where you're getting this arbitrary 24 when in all other usage and verbiage within the regular APCD, say Carl Moyer grant funding opportunities and things like that, it's at 12, it's under 12 miles. So now you're arbitrarily counting vessels that are operating within 24 nautical miles. Before, the commercial passenger fishing fleet was exempt from all this, and now you have arbitrarily added them into all of this. There's numerous points that I know has been brought up in previous conversations, not to mention you in the beginning, you said that Coast Guard had been included in this, and they were not. We've spoken with Coast Guard. They had no idea that this was going on. The engine manufacturers have stated that these types of engines are not safe to operate in our vessels, and to say you have to destroy your whole fleet essentially and rebuild new vessels is wholly unacceptable. We are not these giant tankers. We are not these giant ferries. We're 60-foot beautiful museum quality plank boats. And you want us to destroy our vessels, destroy our small businesses. It's me, my husband, and our 3 kids that operate these businesses. That's who you're dealing with. And you're burying us under mountains of reports and testing requirements. And it's just not acceptable. It's unequitable. The APCD from district to district offers different funding levels. The standard is about $500,000. For Santa Barbara County, the max we can get is $150,000 or 80% of the cost. That is not acceptable. There's a business in our harbor now that has to get $1 million loan to repower, and it turns out they're going to end up having to do it again in a few years because of this. That it makes no sense, and you are disproportionately negatively affecting a wide swath of vessels, and actually it's not compared to other industries. We're very small, and I'm really struggling with where you're getting your numbers from compared to what SAC, the Sport Fishing Association of California, has provided you.
Thank you, Jamie, for the additional information, and we can look into that 12 nautical mile question. Just to clarify, the existing harborcraft regulation, as well as our regulations for ocean-going vessels, define regulated California's waters out to 24 nautical miles. So we're proposing to keep that the way it has been, and we will do our best to continue to work with you on any specific information that you have. I can pivot at this point over to some of the funding questions that you raised, and this also addresses some of Mike Conroy's questions from PCFFA. Anthony Poggi from our Moyer group should be on the line and can take some questions on this, but I'll just read the question, and then Anthony, if you're on the line, if you want to respond to it, that would be great. So he says, to follow up on one of Jamie's points is the amount of Moyer funds made available to the various air quality management districts reported anywhere. Are operations along the North Coast funded to the same degree as operations within the Southern California Bight? Anthony, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me, David?
Yes.
Yes, I'm. I apologize. Can you read the question just one more time? I want to make sure I understand what he's getting at.
Mike was just asking if the amount of funding for marine projects is posted anywhere and how the different districts are apportioned funding through Moyer for marine projects.
They're not apportioned funding for specifically marine projects. They're apportioned funding for their whole program. And if anyone wants to contact me, I can follow up at a different time offline about how the funding is allocated, but they don't get funded for marine projects. Each district makes their own decisions on how much money they want to put towards marine projects, and also how much money per project, if they choose to want to cap it. So that's at the district's discretion.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. We've received a number of other questions. I'm going to skip a few if they were related to what we just talked about and go down a few. So Tracy Fidel, I believe you're with the Port of Oakland. You asked a rather lengthy question about the cost metrics document. Would you like to unmute yourself and verbally ask your question so that everyone can hear it from you? So I don't know if Tracy is there. So due to the details of your question, I think we're going to follow up with you offline. So I'm going to pivot over to Ken Frank from the Sport Fishing Association, who asked, how many of the 508 commercial passenger fishing vessels are gas powered? Are 6-packs now part of the proposed regulation? So Andrew or Nick, if you have information, please chime in here. It's my understanding that there's 300 and something diesel powered 6-pack vessels. And yes, we are proposing to regulate diesel powered 6-pack vessels under the regulation for the total of 508 with the 6-pack plus the 7-passenger and more.
Hello, David?
Yes, is that you, Tracy?
Yeah, this is Tracy.
So I was just calling on you to ask if you wanted to verbally go over your question about Table 6 of the cost metrics document.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. So this is Tracy Fidel with the Port of Oakland. So in Table 6, it says that the number of container and reefer calls were scaled up by 1.61 from 2016 to get to 2030 number of ship calls. And so if you back calculate that, that looks like a 3.5% compounded annual growth rate for container ship calls. But the industry trend over the last 10 years has actually been the opposite. So the trend for container ships is fewer calls by larger vessels. At the Port of Oakland specifically, the CAGR since 2011 has been negative 4.1. So we get fewer calls each year. So to illustrate this problem, back in 2016, the port had 1,726 calls that year. And if we apply CARB's 3.5% growth rate, that means Oakland would have almost 2,000 calls in 2020. But in fact, we're on track to get about 1,270 calls this year. So that means CARB's predicting 700 more calls to Oakland this year alone than is actually happening. So for this regulation, I see a twofold problem. It overestimates the number of tug assist events, which artificially inflates the expected emission reductions that'll be achieved. And it underestimates the cost per TEU of the regulation because it makes it seem like the tug costs are going to be spread out over more calls. So my question to CARB is, how do we correct the assumed growth rate?
Hi, this is Tracy Haynes. I'll take this one. My name is Tracy Haynes. I'm the manager.
Tracy Haynes, you're on mute.
Lost your audio.
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. I apologize. I'll start over. My name is Tracy Haynes. I'm the manager of the section here at CARB that oversees the cost analysis for this rulemaking. Thank you, Tracy, for your question. I'll say a couple of things. One is that this effort, this calculation of cost metrics uses a lot of the same information as the overall cost analysis and some of the same information as the emission inventory, but this is kind of a separate analysis that specifically focuses on metrics to individuals and to specific industries. We do plan to include these metrics in our rulemaking documents, but this was kind of a first stab at producing these metrics, and we're definitely open to receiving new information and more detailed information to further refine it. So we can work with you offline on better understanding some of the issues that you're bringing up specific to the growth metrics.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy, for the question, and Tracy for the response. We have 3 minutes left until the end of the webinar. I did want to respond or allow this gentleman to speak who just provided a comment a few moments ago, and it's from Bill McGavern at the Coalition for Clean Air. He says, a general comment, these craft are significant sources of air pollution that is harming the health of communities and residents, so the rulemaking should proceed with all deliberate speed to require cleaning up the engines to the best available control technologies. Enforcement of the rules to bring in non-reporting vessels should be a priority. Thank you for the comment, Bill. I don't know if you want to unmute yourselves and expand upon that comment or just leave it as it is. We appreciate the feedback from your organization.
Yeah, thanks, David. I'll let the comment stand.
Thank you. So several other questions have come in. We will not be able to get to them all today, but we want to make sure we address them. So I think we could do one of two things, and that's either we could follow up with you individually, or we could alternatively set a meeting, say 2 weeks from today, that would just be focused on these questions plus any more that you have, and we could do it by Zoom or any other platform that makes sense. So if there's a direction either way, I think internally we've discussed another meeting in 2 weeks. If anyone is in favor of that, we'd like to hear from you and we can do it. Otherwise, we'll consider following up with you individually to make sure we understand your concerns and have considered everything that you have to offer. So at this point, I'll allow either Marissa Williams or if Bonnie Soriano, you have any final thoughts for the group, go ahead and take over.
Hi, everyone. This is Marissa. I just want to thank you all for your participation today, and we look forward to continuing the conversation with you all, as David mentioned.
Thank you, Marissa, and thank you everyone for attending. Just to reiterate, we're asking for your feedback by the end of October in order to be considered in time for our SORIA process that folds into our formal regulatory proposal in 2021. we'll be in contact, and please let us know if you have any further questions. Our contact information is on the screen. Have a good rest of your day.